Wall by Pink Floyd is one of the most well-known concept records and possibly the greatest rock opera ever recorded. It spoke to a generation and continues to resonate with listeners today. For many, it's their favorite Floyd album, but it's one that came at the terrible cost of tearing the band apart. On today's program, we are featuring part one of a three-part series of what it took to build the Wall. With the releases of The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals, Pink Floyd cemented themselves as one of the biggest bands in the world, commanding sold-out live tours all around the world. From special effect lighting, state-of-the-art speaker systems, pyrotechnics, and projections, their live shows in the early to mid-70s were like nothing any other band were doing. While they preferred to play smaller venues of 20,000 seats or less, the amount of power their shows required meant that only sports arenas and stadiums could handle the scale. But because of the sheer size of these venues, it took much longer to fill them, and that meant a lot of the audience was there hours before the show started. Also, Pink Floyd rarely employed an opening act, so many of the concertgoers got bored waiting for the band, and this would inevitably lead to drinking, smoking, and other drug use. Often by the time the band came on, a good portion of the audience were pretty loaded or even passed out. And with each tour getting bigger and bigger, Pink Floyd became increasingly aware that they were losing the communal experience that they enjoyed in smaller venues. It was near impossible for them to connect to the crowd beyond the first 30 rows. On top of this, bassist Roger Waters was growing frustrated at the trade-off of having a stadium full of fans diluted the message of their music and gave the impression that the whole show was just about the money. This came to a head on the evening of July 6, 1977. It was their final show of the In the Flesh tour, and things did not go well. From the start, Roger was annoyed with the crowd.
Oh, for fuck's sake, stop letting off fireworks and shouting and screaming. I'm trying to sing the song.
His anger culminated with him spitting on a fan. Apparently, the concertgoer was a part of a group close to the stage that kept shouting at the band the whole concert, and this was starting to get on Roger's nerves. In his mind, this rowdy group of fans represented the views of the entire stadium. He wanted them to be quiet and just experience the music. According to drummer Nick Mason, Roger's actions were way out of character. Normally, he was the one to quell hecklers or kill time during technical difficulties, but he wasn't the only one feeling off that night. When it came time to play their final encore, guitarist David Gilmour didn't return to the stage. Instead, he made his way through the crowd to the back of the house and watched the performance from the mixing board. In that moment, he felt Pink Floyd achieved all they wanted as a band, and he wasn't sure what was left. To make matters worse, he was feeling increasingly depressed during the show because to him, they were ending a 6-month tour with a bad performance and he couldn't stand to finish it. In his stead, roadie Snowy White played guitar. The experience was profound and life-changing for Roger. He left the concert wanting to literally construct a wall to separate himself from the audience. From this feeling, inspiration came to him in droves, and by July of 1978, he recorded 2 demos for 2 complete albums. An early version of The Wall titled Bricks in the Wall, and its follow-up, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. After the band heard both, it was a unanimous decision to move forward with The Wall and to leave the Hitchhiking demo for Roger to release on his own, which he did in 1984. It came as a relief to the band to hear his concept so well formed this early in the process, because for their previous albums, they would often take a long time getting ideas together. But the completeness of the demo made it difficult for the rest of the band to hear where they fit in. Not only that, Roger made it clear from the very beginning that this was his project and the rest of the band will get to play on it. He literally told David that he can help produce, but Nick and Richard would not be invited as producers. Keyboardist Richard Wright insisted he'd be allowed to co-produce, for he feared that without his input, the album would lose the magic of everyone working together. Roger agreed, but only to a trial basis, since in his mind, Richard hadn't really done much producing on their previous albums, despite receiving credit for it. So why did the rest of the band agree to Roger's demands? Well, Basically, no one else had a better idea. Both David Gilmour and Richard Wright spent the early part of 1978 putting most of their creative energies into their own solo albums. From the very beginning, Roger conceived The Wall as an album, a live show, and a film. It was to be a multimedia experience unlike the world had ever seen. But because of the massive scale of the project, Roger brought on Bob Ezrin to help produce and coordinate. He previously produced albums for Lou Reed, Peter Gabriel, and Alice Cooper. One of his first contributions was to write a nearly 40-page script to flesh out the story of The Wall, which was incredibly helpful during recording. Bob was also key in convincing Roger to make the story more universal and less autobiographical, as he foresaw that the audience probably didn't want to hear about the complaints of a rich rock star. Formal recording began at the Britannia Rose studio in the fall of 1978 with James Guthrie as recording engineer and co-producer. Around the same time, Roger brought on artist and animator Gerald Scarfe. It was rather unusual to collaborate with an artist this early in the process, but their relationship proved fruitful. His concept art inspired Roger's lyrics, and in turn, as the songs developed, they informed Gerald's work. The pieces he created became vital to the album artwork, as well as the animations and puppets used for the tour and the 1982 film. Incidentally, the cover art for The Wall marks the first time since Pink Floyd's debut to not feature artwork designed by Hipgnosis. Gerald intended the inside art to be the cover, but Roger opted for the more minimalist cover we see today. By March of 1979, they had a new demo of the album, but they were about to be hit with a host of financial troubles. In 1976, the band hired the financial firm of Norton Warburg to help funnel their pre-tax album royalties into venture capitalist investments. These ranged from skateboards to pizza parlors, hotels, and even an early video game console. These investments protected the band from paying up to 83% tax on their earnings. However, in 1978, the band's financial advisor discovered that those in charge of the firm were taking money from the investment side to offset the failing venture capital side. Essentially, the executives were falsifying profits to hide the fact they were actually losing money. The company folded soon after, leaving the band with a £3 million loss and owing the Crown anywhere from £5 to £12 million in back taxes. It became quite clear that they needed to make a lot of money quickly. Since The Wall was still far from complete, they were advised to leave the country for at least a year and make as much money as possible. This would not only allow them to legally avoid paying taxes on those earnings, but more importantly, it would give them the time they needed to finish The Wall. It was do or die for the band. They relocated to Super Bear Studios in the mountains above Nice, France, a choice made easier by the fact that both David and Richard used this studio to record their solo albums, and they enjoyed the atmosphere of the location. In the beginning, things went smoothly, but as the sessions wore on, cracks began to form between Roger and the rest of the band. Roger was always a bit of a bully in the group, but now his ego was getting the better of him. It was becoming clear that Roger wanted to take control of the band and push out those who opposed him. Nick Mason escaped most of the drama since he finished all his drum parts early in the process. David Gilmour pushed back because he thought that while Roger was a strong lyricist, music was not his forte. He knew Roger needed him in order for the album to be successful. This left Richard an easy target for Roger's frustrations. To be fair, they never had a great relationship to begin with. Even in the early days, he was always Roger's punching bag. If anything, they more tolerated each other for the sake of the band. But the crack between them grew even larger when Richard asked to be producer on The Wall. By all accounts, Richard didn't do anything during the recording sessions. He would just sit in the studio all day and not really contribute to the process apart from a few mutterings here and there. It got so distracting that Bob asked him to not come to their sessions anymore. Instead, Richard would go into the studio in the evening when Bob and Roger weren't there, but even then, he really didn't record anything. It was like Roger set him up to fail. According to Bob, Richard wasn't the type who performed well on his own. He really needed positive reinforcement to be his best. He needed that back and forth feedback from Roger saying, yes, that's good, or don't do that, try something like this. Richard had trouble expressing his thoughts around someone like Roger, who could be very direct and short-tempered. Whether intentional or not, Roger didn't have time to baby him or coax out his feelings. In Roger's mind, they were on a deadline. Everyone else was working extremely hard on getting this record made, and here was Richard sitting on his butt, not pulling his weight, and he had the nerve to ask to be producer on his record. I can't say I really blame Roger. In Richard's defense, though, he was going through a painful divorce at this time and he was missing his children terribly. The other band members' kids were young enough to travel with them to France, but Richards had to stay in school miles away in England. In short, he wasn't contributing anything because he was depressed and didn't know it. The rest of the band saw this as him not caring, which wasn't true. Things came to a head when sometime in June of '79, Columbia Records offered to increase the band's percentage points if they could deliver the album by the 1979 holiday season. Roger and Bob did some calculations and concluded they could make the deadline, but only if they employed a second recording studio and cut their summer break short by 1 week. Everyone agreed on the terms except for Richard. He wasn't willing to sacrifice vacation time with his family. This set Roger off to no end. The majority of the keyboard parts still needed to be recorded, and this was holding up the record. In Roger's mind, he was left with no choice but to make an ultimatum. Richard either leaves the band, or he will release the album under his name, not Pink Floyd's. Even though David felt Roger was way out of line holding the album hostage, he couldn't help but agree that Richard wasn't contributing much to the record. It wasn't personal, it was just business. They couldn't afford to lose the album to Roger. They had to release it as Pink Floyd. Though it pained him, Richard left the band, but on the condition that he could finish his parts for the album and then play on the tour. Roger agreed, but the matter was kept from the public. By September, recording moved to Los Angeles, where most of the sound effects were captured as well as where the final mix took place. And just like that, in little over a year, with roughly 4 to 6 months logged in the studio and nearly $700,000 spent, they finished the album. But when they played it for their record label, Columbia was disappointed. They were not expecting a double album rock opera. They even tried to cut their losses by telling Roger he would receive a reduced percentage. He fought back, and Columbia executive Dick Asher offered to flip a coin to settle the matter. Roger replied with, "Why should he gamble on something he rightfully owned?" CBS backed down. In order for The Wall to fit on 2 records, a few changes needed to be made. What Shall We Do Now was cut completely, In the Flesh was shortened, as well as The Thin Ice. These changes were made at the very last minute and after all the printing was done, which is why some copies list a missing song and an incorrect running order. Also, whether intentional or not, Nick Mason and Richard Wright's names are nowhere to be found on original pressings. This was corrected on later editions, however. The Wall was released on the 30th of November in the UK, and by the time the album came out in America, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 became a surprise #1 hit single. The record spawned 3 more radio singles: Comfortably Numb, Run Like Hell, and Hey You. The album wasn't initially a hit with the critics, but commercially it did incredibly well, with over 1 million copies sold in the first 2 months. It would go on to be Pink Floyd's second best-selling record just after The Dark Side of the Moon. Sadly, The Wall also represents the last time the 4 original members of Pink Floyd ever recorded together. David Gilmour later said it was the last of him and Roger working well together. But nearly 25 years later, the 4 would reunite one last time for a 20-minute live gig at the 2005 Live 8 concert. It's unclear if Richard and Roger ever made amends, but seeing them standing together up on that stage makes me believe that in the end, they could at least set aside their differences for the greater good. Really, I'm just glad that after all they went through as a band, they could have that happy reunion before Richard's untimely death in 2008. Well, I hate to leave it on that sad note, but this is the end of part 1 of the story of how The Wall was made. Join me for parts 2 and 3 where I dive into the tour and finally how the film was made. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Hey everybody, thanks again for checking out this making of video. Be sure to watch my review of the album, and while you're at it, check out my other Pink Floyd content. If you like what you see, I put out new videos every Tuesday and sometimes Fridays.